Welcome back. As Muslims, it is our moral obligation to be aware of injustices in our own backyard and speak out for positive change. Earlier last month, the remote Northern Ontario First Nation community of Attawapiskat declared a state of emergency following a sudden increase in suicide attempts. The chief of the community said, "The problems of our community were not created overnight. They have festered over time and are now only becoming exposed." To help us understand this complex issue, we are honored to have with us Coty Zachariah, Chairman of National Aboriginal Caucus for the Canadian Federation of Students. Let's get his thoughts on the recent crisis in Attawapiskat. Welcome to the show, Coty.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to ask you a very difficult question. Why were youth committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide in Attawapiskat?
So Attawapiskat community is very remote. They face a lot of problems that a lot of remote First Nations communities face, like access to healthy and clean water, programming for youth, affordable food. Things like bananas in the grocery store cost maybe 1,000 times more in places up there, which makes it really hard to get a quality meal. So I think it's just the standard of living is very subpar to the rest of Canada. It's unfortunate because it's letting the youth or leading the youth to feel despair. If you feel that you're not being taken care of or you don't feel equal in this country, that's going to take an effect on you mentally. So I think youth in Attawapiskat and similar communities face a lot of loneliness and desperation, and they feel ignored and forgotten. So I think that's what leads to a lot of the problems.
And it's interesting, I noticed you mentioned you're not just sticking to Attawapiskat, you're talking about First Nations communities broadly as well. So this is not an issue while Attawapiskat was in the media. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about is a larger issue.
Absolutely. There's been a lot of attention on Attawapiskat, rightfully so, with this problem, but it's definitely not just a problem there. This is happening in communities all across Canada, in northern BC, in Winnipeg. This is not just a problem that's only in Attawapiskat.
Now tell me, what went through your mind when you heard about the state of emergency in Attawapiskat? How did that impact you personally?
When I first heard about the state of emergency, I wasn't sure why. It's always heartbreaking to hear that, but then when you hear it's about youth suicide and a group of 11 people attempting that, or suicide pacts between youth, that's heartbreaking. This is our youth, this is our next generation, these are the people that are going to carry on the teachings, going to carry on the community, and they're just not seeing that vision, they're not feeling that love, so it's totally heartbreaking when our youth are feeling like there's no other way.
I know you do a lot of work in the community and your own personal journey as well, so tell us a little bit about that.
So I'm from Tyendinaga, Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, but I spent most of my life growing up in Toronto in an urban setting, so I'm what people would refer to as an urban Indigenous person. Growing up in an urban city, I was exposed to maybe a lot more colonialism than, say, people in the reserve.
Why is that?
I think I see it every day. People in the reserve, I think when you go out, you see a lot more of your own people. In Toronto, I didn't really see that a lot. You're exposed to a lot more of Canadian culture being in major cities. I feel like you almost have to conform to the Canadian culture way a lot more in cities as well. I have to work in their stores. I have to get money to pay bills and things like that. So you learn the system, or you're more exposed to it in the city.
And how is that different from being in the community, and specifically, I guess, your own community?
In the community, I would say that a lot of people are more together. I would say that they're a little bit closer to the teachings, to the ceremonies, to the sweat lodge, to the longhouse. My people are the longhouse people. I don't know of a longhouse in Toronto, so that's where we would go have ceremony. So for me to have ceremony, I need to drive out of Toronto, actually. So that impacts my connection.
And growing up, did you feel that, because you said you grew up mainly in Toronto, right? So
Mm-hmm.
were you, did you feel that you had that cultural identity and that sense of community, or did you feel a little bit removed?
I felt removed growing up in the city. I knew that I was First Nations growing up. I grew up with certain teachings, but I didn't grow up with the same amount of exposure to the culture. I didn't really go to a lot of powwows or events like that. where people get to rejoice in being Indigenous. I wasn't really exposed to that at a young age. So that's not something I grew up with. It's something I kind of developed later on in my life.
So how did you develop it? No pressure.
I started by drumming. That was how I initially got connected. My father invited me to a drum circle, and you could feel the heartbeat there, and he explained why it was so important for us to drum. We drum for the people who cannot. We drum for the sick, the young, the elderly. Yeah, we do it because it's empowering. It's the heartbeat of the people. And up to 50, 60 years ago, that was banned. We weren't allowed to do this. I wouldn't even be allowed to wear what I'm wearing right now. So I mean, this is like, it's been so eye-opening for me. It's almost been like a reclamation of my culture.
And the drumming is, I guess, is it a way to bring the community together, and that's sort of how you started to connect back with your culture?
Absolutely. At the socials at the Native Canadian Centre at Spadina and Bloor is where I first got exposed to how the music brings people together, and it was mind-blowing.
And how old were you when you started to discover your culture again?
In my late teens. I was probably 17 before I started actually seeking things, because I was starting to have this sense that something's missing. Yeah, there was a cultural community, cultural familiarity that was just not there. I knew that I was First Nations, but I didn't have that connection, so I felt like I needed that to be more holistic.
And now I know a lot of the work that you do is also related to First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities. So tell us a little bit about how, now your work that you're doing sort of helps bridge those connections of, your identity and who you are.
Yeah, I think I'm very privileged to do the work that I do. I get to work with the culture. I get to bridge knowledge gaps. I think that's what's the most important thing to me with this work, especially with youth. Is letting people know that it's okay to be who you are and to maybe not know certain things about other people, but there's a chance to learn. I think there's this hesitancy of, oh, I don't know, so I'm afraid to ask a silly question. But sometimes we need to get through those silly questions to have actual dialogue.
So what kind of work do you do? I know a couple of organizations that you work with, so I'll leave it to you.
I work with a couple organizations. It's mostly with students and with youth. I work with the Canadian Federation of Students, where I advocate for Indigenous students from coast to coast. So I basically would take all their concerns or issues that we're facing in communities or in education institutions, and I try to create motions, or I lobby the government in terms of trying to remedy those problems. With Canadian Roots Exchange, it's a bit more hands-on with youth, so I kind of like that aspect of it. I get to do workshops right in Toronto. We also do cultural exchanges where we'll go out to reserves with groups of not just Indigenous, but Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and newcomer. So I mean, it's bringing people together and just to talk and experience things together, because I think a lot of times you get the stereotypes. Yeah. Or the stigmas, and I think that holds us back,
And obviously, it's really great about just hearing about the kind of work that you do. I want to taking all of that into perspective, your own upbringing, sort of how you've come to connect with the culture, the work that you do. Taking the conversation now back to Attawapiskat and other First Nations communities. Where do you see the future for First Nations communities? And I ask this because, back in April, there was also, a statement that came out by the community where Chief Bruce mentioned that, they got funding. They got funding from the provincial government, so, things are looking a little bit better, but still there's a lot. And I also ask you this because this is not the first time we've heard about Attawapiskat, unfortunately, in a state of emergency, right? And Attawapiskat is just one community, like you mentioned. So are you, I guess my question for you is, are you hopeful for the future?
I am hopeful for the future. I think that's what helps me do this work, because it gets heavy at times. Attawapiskat alone has had, I think, 5 state of emergencies in the last 10 years. That's a problem that's not being solved. And I think a lot of the times there's these Band-Aid solutions, or mental health support workers will go in for a certain amount of days or weeks, and then they just leave.
Yeah.
So I think what will actually create change is long-term, sustainable problem solving. Empowering these youth, not just sending someone in, programming for the youth. I heard that there's going to be a new youth center. So I'm optimistic about that, because that gives people something to do. I know me as a teen, I always went to the rec center, and that's where I saw people, that's where I saw my friends, that's where I got to exert energy. So I think having things like that is healthy for the youth. At this point, I would like to see more than just the promises, and it's great that money's being allocated to this problem, but I would like to see some long-term supports and programs there, not just temporarily.
And what can the average Canadian do who wants to, obviously when people hear about this, I know my Facebook newsfeed was flooded, people were sharing articles and that kind of thing. So what can the average Canadian do who wants to help but maybe doesn't know how to or where to go? What advice would you have?
I think it just starts with understanding, because if you don't maybe understand the root of the issue, doesn't matter how many things are on your Facebook feed, you might just screen that out, right? So it's important to understand what's going on, the problem. I know there's always this urgency of, well, what can we do now? And I think that's great. I think that's a really positive energy, that people want to help. And there's a lot of ways to help. There's organizations in the city. You can send letters of support to Attawapiskat, keeping in touch with the youth, giving them some hope. I would say, yeah, it starts with understanding and then healthy engagement.
Thank you. I know this must have been, obviously a difficult conversation to have, so I really appreciate you coming on and sharing information. I look forward to having you back on.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.